What's up everybody, it's Joe here with Joseph Blake Photography, and in today's video, now that we have the specs for the R1, or at least confirmed, we've had the specs for a little while, we're going to compare the R1, new flagship camera from Canon, to the camera they said wasn't the flagship camera, the EOS R3. Okay, real quick before we get into the specs, I know that people are going to yell at me in the comments and say, oh, this is all rumors, we don't know what the specs are going to be. These specs really haven't changed as far as what we've been seeing for 3 or 4 months. This thing has been in development forever. It's been in the hands of folks, and now retailers are leaking the specs accidentally. So I think we can pretty comfortably say that most of these specifications are going to be what we're going to get with the EOS R1. We already know what the R3 is. And so I think we can be pretty comfortable in going through these bits of information. When the Canon EOS R3 was announced, everybody saw this camera and said, wait, this is the flagship? Is this just the R1 with a different name? And Canon was very clear and said, no, this is not a flagship camera. Obviously, at that time, the 1DX Mark III was still out, and I don't know. And I think comparing these two, the camera that everyone looked at as the potential indicator for what a flagship camera from Canon would look like, and now the specs that we have from the actual R1 flagship camera. So let's start with the sensor. So number one, on the Canon R1, we are going to be getting a 30 megapixel stacked style sensor. It is a rolling shutter sensor. 30 megapixels, I know disappointing some, but it will be a 30 megapixel sensor. It will be 100% electronic. We pretty much know that now for absolute certain, but because of the extremely fast readout speed of that sensor, it will not need a mechanical shutter. From a still shooting perspective, the R1 will be shooting at both 40 and 60 frames per second. That is with 1:2 and 1:3 lossy CRAW compression in that new format. And that is unlimited, meaning that with the Digic X Plus accelerator, we will be able to effectively run at 40 and 60 FPS shooting until you fill up your card. But it also has a burst mode. So on the burst mode side, we're gonna get 120 frames per second. That's full, and we know that it's continuous, but we don't know how many of those we'll get before we fill up the buffer. We'll also be getting 240 frames per second burst, but not in the same style as the 120. At 120 frames per second, you're gonna get full functionality. That means you're gonna get the full autofocus, you're gonna get RAW, all the things. But at 240, it will not be full functionality. There will be some things missing. I still think it'll be RAW, but I think maybe a slightly lower megapixel, maybe lower bit rate. Maybe they will shut off some of the autofocus functions or some of the exposure compensation as the camera shoots. On the focus side, this is the thing that we've actually heard the most about. It will have, using that Digic X accelerator chip, an improved AI tracking system that will institute what's called action priority and allow the camera to track subjects through action and maintain them in focus, even as they move through different areas of the frame, both in front of and behind different subjects, and it will just lock on track. And on the processor side, it's still coming with that Digic X, and as I mentioned, it will be coming now with the Digic accelerator chip. All right, so that's the Canon R1 on the stills side. Let's take a look at the R3 on the stills side. The R3 has a 24 megapixel backside illuminated sensor. So right off the bat, we see that we're getting a megapixel bump. We're getting a little bit more resolution. Also claim 2 more stops of dynamic range out of the new sensor, out of the Canon R1, both because of the sensor and with the Digic accelerator chip. It's going to be providing better dynamic range with 2 stops. Additionally, on the speed side, 12 frames per second mechanical. That sensor does come with a mechanical shutter. 30 frames per second in electronic shooting mode without using the mechanical shutter. And that is up to, in RAW, 420 shots before the buffer fills up. On the burst side, with Canon firmware version 1.2, gained the ability to shoot burst RAW up to 195 frames per second. But there's a bit of a catch here. It's 195 frames a second between 2 and 50 frames. So you get to go in and say, I want 2 frames or 10 frames or 20 frames. This is a custom high-speed shooting mode, maxes out at 50 frames. We don't know how many frames we'll get at 120 and 240 on the R1, but we know that with the 195, it maxes out at 50 frames. Also in that high speed continuous shooting mode, you get fixed autofocus, meaning the autofocus doesn't change, and fixed exposure. On the R3 side, from focusing, you have the dual pixel autofocus 2. The R3 instituted a new feature called person priority, where it would know to follow an individual. It could follow a person around. Very curious to see that feature, person priority, up against action priority in the R1. On the processor side, just coming with that Digic X processor that we have seen in now a handful of Canon cameras. Okay, so that's it on the still side with the R1 headed up against the R3. Now, let's go ahead and take a close look at these features, and obviously the two things that pop out the most are the speed of continuous shooting, meaning unlimited 40 and 60 frames per second, although we still need to see how the compression on those CRAW files look, as well as the improved autofocus out of the R1. Moving over to the video side of things, obviously you're getting a bit of a spec bump on the sensor, you're going to get a bit of a spec bump on the video capabilities. The sensor is not big enough to provide 8K footage, so they're basically giving us the entire sensor to be able to shoot video. So you will have 6.7K, 4.2K, and 4K DCI. And on the codec side, the R1 is going to be coming with a 12-bit Cinema Raw Lite codec. That is fantastic. The additional bitrate of color so that you can do more with it. That, along with the additional dynamic range of the sensor, should be phenomenal for folks who are shooting in very dynamic and very difficult high contrast environments. And the fact that it's going to be Cinema Raw Lite means that the camera is going to be doing a lot of work to compress that into the file and to keep your file sizes a little bit smaller. It'll also be coming with Canon Log 2 and 3, with frame rates available at 60 and 120 frames per second, 60 at 6.7, 120 at 4.2. Comparing that to the R3, which was no slouch in the video department, came in at 6K and 4K and 4K DCI, obviously with a 24 megapixel sensor, that's what you can get. It did offer raw shooting in 10-bit in both standard and light versions, but only C-Log 3. It also came with 60 and 120 frames per second at 6 and 4K, and it did get, through a firmware update, a 240 frame per second HD mode, which we don't yet know will be on the R1, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something just like that. Not specifically mentioned on the specs, just a couple of other things that I wanted to mention. The body looks just a little bit bigger. Looks like it's got a new pattern on the grip, more of a diamond pattern, which I think is cool looking. It will have a 1,250 second or 1/1250th of a second flash sync. That is as a result of that super fast readout on that electronic shutter. Also, I had heard that on the stills side, you will be able to opt for 16-bit RAW, though I do not know if that'll be available in some of those higher frame rate shooting modes. And obviously we'll get CF Express and dual batteries and LAN port, all the normal things that you would expect from a big body professional Canon camera. But here's the conclusion as we wrap up this head-to-head on these two cameras. Number one, the Canon R1 is going to be coming with a bigger, better, faster sensor. We see that in almost every specification. No mention if the R1 is specifically going to be getting eye autofocus, but I really don't know. I doubt that they would leave that out. The real question is whether or not that's going to end up in the Mark II. But no mention of that specifically on this camera. No mention of weight, and obviously no mention of price. Right now, the R3 was originally announced at $49.99, and it's been discounted over time. Sometimes you can find it as low as $42, depending on the site, and I'm sure there's some refurbished options that you can get even less than that. I expect the R1 to be coming at $59.99 or potentially $61.99, depending on a couple of those features that they do make available. One other thing, or one other rumor that we've been hearing, is that this particular AI functionality may come with some sort of a subscription. And I'll be honest, there's a part of me that just immediately cringes to that idea. But here's what I think they're going to do. I don't think it's going to be the chip itself being activated by some sort of subscription. You're not going to have to put your camera near a Wi-Fi hotspot once a month to validate to the cloud that you have the subscription installed. But what I think they will do is offer you the ability to potentially take some of the features of the camera and make them available in the cloud, like some of those AI features that we're seeing in other applications, and that you will be able to get those through a subscription model. That's my assumption. That's my hope. We'll see what happens. Anyway, that's the head-to-head between the R1 and the R3. And before you yell at me in the comments that this is all just rumors and speculation, take a look everywhere else. These are the specs that we're getting. I'm sure there will be more and different and additional exciting bits of information that we'll get against the R1. But if you want to talk about speeds and feeds, if you just want to talk about resolution and speed and codecs and all that sort of thing, this is what we're going to get. And I am excited for this camera. I'm excited to Canon moving things forward. And if this is the kind of thing that you're into, go ahead and hit the like button. Go and hit subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And I will